Hello everyone, welcome to this channel. Today we are going to study a very interesting and enjoyable story written by O. Henry. The title of the story is Hearts and Hands. Before we begin, a request to you all, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the like button if you find the video useful. William Sidney Porter was an American writer who wrote under the pen name O. Henry. His short stories are well known for their ready wit, gentle humor, and surprise endings. These surprise endings are often referred to as the O. Henry twist. Pen name means the name that he had assumed for the purposes of writing. So O. Henry is not his real name. His real name is William Sidney Porter. His story Hearts and Hands describes the chance encounter on a train between two acquaintances, that is Miss Fairchild and Mr. Easton. A chance encounter, which means an accidental meeting. The situation turns awkward when Miss Fairchild notices that Easton is handcuffed to a grim-looking man. So when she notices this, the situation becomes very difficult. The man intervenes to save Easton from embarrassment and prevent the girl from discovering the truth about him. So the man, the grim-looking man who had handcuffed Mr. Easton to himself, he steps in and he saves Easton from being embarrassed. Why? Because the two are acquaintances. Miss Fairchild and Mr. Easton know each other, but Miss Fairchild does not know the truth about Mr. Easton. It is only through the observations of their fellow passengers that the reader is made aware of the real nature of the relationship between the two men handcuffed to each other. So in the story, Miss Fairchild never finds out the truth. Only the reader, the person who is reading the story, finds out the truth, and that too because of the conversation that happens between two other passengers. Let us look at the outline of the story. Miss Fairchild is a pretty young woman. She is traveling on a train. She is all alone. The train stops at Denver and two men get on and they occupy the seat opposite to her. One of the men is Mr. Easton. He is handcuffed to the other man who is a marshal. So one of the men is Mr. Easton. The other man is a marshal. A marshal means a police officer. So the police officer has handcuffed Mr. Easton to himself, which means Mr. Easton must have committed some crime. In order to avoid an embarrassing situation, the marshal pretends to be the criminal who is being taken to jail by Mr. Easton. So the marshal or the police officer does not want to make the situation awkward. He doesn't want it to become embarrassing. So he pretends that he is the criminal and Mr. Easton is actually the police officer. Miss Fairchild believes this and she gushes over Mr. Easton's position. The moment she hears that Mr. Easton has become a marshal or rather a police officer, she starts praising him. At the end of the story, it is revealed through the manner in which they were handcuffed that in reality Mr. Easton is a criminal who is being taken to prison for counterfeiting and the other man is the real marshal. So at the end of the story, the author reveals this reality to the readers. How does he reveal it? He reveals it through the manner in which the two men were handcuffed to each other. So the readers come to know that the truth is that Mr. Easton is the criminal and the other man is the real marshal. Why is Mr. Easton a criminal? Because he has been counterfeiting, which means he has been printing fake currency notes and he is being taken to prison. At Denver, there was an influx of passengers into the coaches on the eastbound B&M Express. B&M Express is the name of a train and it is going towards the east. Denver is the name of the station. Influx of passengers means that many passengers got onto the train. In one coach, there sat a very pretty young woman. Now, this pretty young woman is Miss Fairchild. dressed in elegant taste, which means her clothes, her shoes, it was all very elegant. She was very well dressed and surrounded by all the luxurious comforts of an experienced traveler. So it means that she is quite well to do. She comes from a wealthy family. Among the newcomers were two young men. So among the people who got onto the train at Denver, there were two young men also. One of handsome presence. One of the young men, he was good looking and he was well dressed with a bold, frank countenance and manner. So he was also very confident. He appeared to be quite confident and easygoing. The other means the other young man, a ruffled, glum faced person. He looked a little untidy and he seemed to be very serious, very gloomy faced. He was heavily built, which means he was a little stout and roughly dressed. The two were handcuffed together. So it means that since the two were handcuffed together, one of them must have been a police officer and the other person must have been a criminal. As they passed down the aisle of the coach, the only vacant seat offered was a reversed one facing the attractive young woman. So they had no option, they had to sit in the seat which was opposite to the young woman. Here the linked couple, which means the two men, seated themselves. The young woman's glance fell upon them with a distant, swift disinterest. So at first the young woman, she just gave them a very cool, a casual glance. Then, with a lovely smile brightening her countenance and a tender pink tinging her rounded cheeks, she held out a little grey gloved hand. So first she just looked at them casually, but then immediately her face changed. She smiled beautifully and in fact she even started to blush a little bit. It was evident that she was very happy seeing one of them, which is why she held out her hand. When she spoke, her voice, full, sweet, and deliberate, proclaimed that its owner was accustomed to speak and be heard. Well, Mr. Easton, if you will make me speak first, I suppose I must. Don't you ever recognize old friends when you meet them in the West? So right now they are in the west and they are traveling eastwards. So that is why she addresses one of the two men by saying that Mr. Easton, you are not speaking to me first. Maybe you are waiting for me to acknowledge you. Doesn't matter. If you will make me speak first, it's fine. I suppose I must. But don't you recognize me? After all, we are old friends. When she spoke, her voice full, sweet, and deliberate. It means that when she spoke in a very confident voice. She had a very sweet voice. She was very sure of herself, and her voice proclaimed that its owner was accustomed to speak and be heard, which means that she was very confident and she knew that when I speak, people will acknowledge me, they will respond to me, they will listen to me. The younger man roused himself sharply at the sound of her voice, which means that he had not noticed her before, and now he became very much alarmed. Seemed to struggle with a slight embarrassment, which he threw off instantly, and then clasped her fingers with his left hand. So the young man, he became a little alarmed. He was slightly flustered, but then immediately he regained his poise, and then he took her hand and he gave it a shake. "It's Miss Fairchild," he said with a smile. "I'll ask you to excuse the other hand. It's otherwise engaged just at present." So he said, "Yes, of course, it's Miss Fairchild. Please excuse me because I am using my left hand to shake your hand. My other hand is engaged at the moment." He slightly raised his right hand, bound at the wrist by the shining bracelet. Bracelet here means handcuff, to the left one of his companion. So he showed her that, see, this is why my right hand is engaged at the moment. The glad look in the girl's eyes slowly changed to a bewildered horror. The glow faded from her cheeks. Her lips parted in a vague, relaxing distress. So the girl had been very happy to see him, but the moment she saw the handcuffs, immediately her expression changed. She was totally confused now. And especially, she could never have accepted that she was traveling on a train and just in front of her, something so called shady was happening. That is, there was a criminal who was seated opposite to her. Easton, with a little laugh, as if amused, was about to speak again when the other forestalled him. So when Mr. Easton saw Miss Fairchild's reaction, that she had seen the handcuffs and she was horrified, he knew that he is going to be embarrassed now. So he gave a little laugh as if he was very much amused, but the reality was that he must have been feeling nervous and helpless. But he started to speak again. He was about to speak, but the police officer spoke before him. The glum-faced man had been watching the girl's countenance with veiled glances from his keen, shrewd eyes. So the police officer was very clever and very sharp. Already, the moment she started to speak to Mr. Easton, he had examined Miss Fairchild's face. He had seen her expressions. "You'll excuse me for speaking, miss, but I see you're acquainted with the marshal here." So he addressed her directly, that "Miss, please excuse me for speaking to you. I am speaking because I can see that you know the marshal. If you'll ask him to speak a word for me when we get to the pen, he'll do it, and it will make things easier for me there. He's taking me to Leavenworth prison. It's 7 years for counterfeiting." So the glum-faced man, who in reality was a police officer, said something totally different, totally opposite to Miss Fairchild. Okay? He made her believe that Mr. Easton was not a criminal. In fact, he was a police officer, and he himself pretended to be the criminal. He asked her that, "Will you please tell the marshal to put in a word for me when we reach the prison? After all, I have to spend 7 years there. I am going to Leavenworth prison, and I have been printing fake currency notes, which is why I have been jailed there." "Oh," said the girl, with a deep breath and returning color. So she was relieved. "So that is what you are doing out here? A marshal?" So Miss Fairchild didn't even reply to the police officer. She thought Mr. Easton, her old friend, her old acquaintance, he is a marshal. So she became very happy. "My dear Miss Fairchild," said Easton calmly, "I had to do something." So now Easton is relaxed and he addresses her in a very sophisticated manner. He says, "I had to do something. After all, we have to work to earn a living. Money has a way of taking wings unto itself. So money gets spent very fast. And you know it takes money to keep step with our crowd in Washington." So when he says our crowd in Washington, it means the elite circle, the circle of wealthy people with whom he socializes. And if you want to socialize with wealthy people, you need to have money. "I saw this opening in the West. So I saw this opportunity, and well, a marshalship isn't quite as high a position as that of ambassador, but—" So he says that it's all right, I've become a marshal, a police officer, but still my position is not as high as that of an ambassador. But the ambassador, said the girl warmly, doesn't call anymore. He needn't ever have done so. You ought to know that. So the girl now says that the ambassador doesn't visit me anymore. In fact, he needn't ever have done so, which means I wasn't that interested in him. So we can easily infer that the ambassador might have been one of her suitors, and maybe she showed a little bit of interest in him at first, but now she's not interested in him at all. Even he's not interested in her. And when she says you ought to know that, it means that she's showing some interest in Mr. Easton, because she's fascinated with the fact that he's a marshal now. And so now you are one of those dashing Western heroes, and you ride and shoot and go into all kinds of dangers. That's different from the Washington life. You have been missed from the old crowd. So here she is romanticizing the role of a marshal, and she's imagining that Mr. Easton now is leading such a thrilling and exciting life and is doing such brave deeds, while life in Washington is much more urbane and sophisticated. In her eyes, not as exciting. So she says, you have been missed from the old crowd. The girl's eyes, fascinated, went back, widening a little to rest upon the glittering handcuffs. So as she was speaking, once again she looked at the handcuffs. She appeared quite fascinated with whatever she was hearing and seeing. "Don't you worry about them, miss," said the other man. "All marshals handcuff themselves to their prisoners to keep them from getting away. Mr. Easton knows his business." So the real police officer, he spoke up again, saying that don't worry about the handcuffs. He's handcuffed to me because he's a police officer and he does not want me to escape. Mr. Easton knows his business. So Mr. Easton knows his job very well. Will we see you again soon in Washington? Asked the girl. So even now the girl is not replying to the police officer because she doesn't know he's the police officer. She thinks he's a criminal and she would not speak to him. Not soon, I think, said Easton. My butterfly days are over, I fear. So Easton says that no, you won't see me again soon because my butterfly days are over, which means that now I will not be able to move around as freely as I used to before. I love the West, said the girl irrelevantly. Her eyes were shining softly. She looked away out the car window. She began to speak truly and simply without the gloss of style and manner. So she said this irrelevantly, which means that she perhaps pretended to change the topic, but in reality, she was only continuing the conversation because Mr. Easton had told her previously that his butterfly days are over, which means that he has to remain in the West. He cannot keep visiting Washington too often. Her eyes were shining softly, which means that perhaps she was experiencing some tender feelings. And she looked out of the car window because she did not want to look directly at his face. And then she began speaking very genuinely to him. Mama and I spent the summer in Denver. So she's explaining why she was in Denver. She went home a week ago because father was slightly ill. I could live and be happy in the West. I think the air here agrees with me. So she is giving a hint to Mr. Easton that she would like to live in the West. She would like to be near him. Money isn't everything. So over here, she is replying to Mr. Easton's previous reference to the ambassador. And then she says, but people always misunderstand things and remain stupid. So perhaps she means to say that Mr. Easton is not taking the hint. She is quite interested in him, but he is not responding to her because perhaps he doesn't realize that she is interested. So at this point, the glum-faced man, that is the actual marshal, he thinks that things are going too far, so he decides to interrupt. Say, Mr. Marshal, growled the glum-faced man, this isn't quite fair. I'm needing a drink and I haven't had a smoke all day. Haven't you talked long enough? Take me in the smoker now, won't you? I'm half dead for a pipe. The bound travelers rose to their feet, Easton with the same slow smile on his face. He really couldn't do anything. He had to obey the marshal. But as he got up, he still had the same slow smile on his face. Perhaps he was trying to show that everything is normal. I can't deny a petition for tobacco, he said lightly. It's the one friend of the unfortunate. Goodbye, Miss Fairchild. Duty calls, you know. He held out his hand for a farewell. So while leaving also, Mr. Easton kept on pretending that he was the marshal and the other man was the criminal. It's too bad you're not going east, she said, reclothing herself with manner and style. But you must go on to Leavenworth, I suppose. So she also reclothed herself with manner and style, which means that she also once again started speaking in a very artificial and sophisticated manner. She now was making polite conversation. And Easton also replied politely, yes, I must go on to Leavenworth. The two men sidled down the aisle into the smoker. So both the men left now. The two passengers in a seat nearby. So in a nearby seat, there were two other passengers, two other men. They had heard most of the conversation. Said one of them, that Marshall's a good sort of chap. Some of these Western fellows are all right, which means that the Marshal is quite good-natured. Pretty young to hold an office like that, isn't he? Asked the other. So the other fellow said, yes, but imagine, he's so young and he's a marshal. Young? Exclaimed the first speaker. Why? Oh, didn't you catch on? Say, did you ever know an officer to handcuff a prisoner to his right hand? So the first speaker was surprised and he told the second speaker, what do you mean he was young? Are you trying to tell me that you didn't understand what was really happening? Didn't you catch on? Tell me one thing. Do you know of an officer who would handcuff a prisoner to his right hand, which means a policeman would never handcuff a prisoner to his right hand. They would always handcuff a prisoner to their left hand. So the prisoner's right hand would be handcuffed to the marshal's left hand, not the other way around. So this is how they understood who in reality was the marshal and who was the criminal. The moment they saw the two men, and as they were listening to the conversation, one of the men, he was very sharp. So he realized that the person whose right hand is handcuffed is the criminal, and the person whose left hand is handcuffed is the actual marshal. Let us now examine the following points with regard to the story. First, appearances versus reality. Mr. Easton was handsome, well dressed, and well spoken. He was also well known to Miss Fairchild, and he socialized with wealthy people. So it was quite natural for Miss Fairchild to believe that he was a marshal. On the other hand, the marshal was glum, heavily built, and roughly dressed. So it was easy for Miss Fairchild to cast him in the role of a criminal. So in this way, the outward appearance of the two men was completely opposite to who they really were. Secondly, let us look at the title of the story, Hearts and Hands. The marshal and Mr. Easton were handcuffed to each other. The marshal's heart was in the right place, which is why he behaved kindly in the situation. Miss Fairchild and Mr. Easton's hearts were both congenial towards each other, but Easton's handcuffed hands prevented them from coming close to each other. A situational irony is when the unexpected takes place. And over here, in particular, with particular regard to the works of O. Henry, it is termed as the O. Henry twist. So, as first time readers, we could not have imagined that in the end there would be an unexpected twist and that what we were believing till now was contrary to the truth of the situation. Verbal irony is when words express something which is contrary to the truth. For example, when Mr. Easton says, I had to do something, I saw this opening in the west, money has a way of taking wings. At that time, we think that he is talking about his job as a marshal. But in reality, he has been printing counterfeit notes. When the marshal says, Mr. Easton knows his business, what he means to say is, Mr. Easton is a criminal. Then again, when Mr. Easton says, my butterfly days are over, I fear. Yes, I must go on to live in Worth. At that time, he is actually referring to the fact that he is going to jail. He is not talking about his duty as a police officer. Before ending the lesson, let us look at the following points. Miss Fairchild was a wealthy, sophisticated, and relatively naive young woman. She would never have even considered the possibility of coming face to face with a criminal. In fact, she could have created a scene and caused a disturbance on the train. She would also have been bitterly disappointed to know the truth about Mr. Easton, simply because she knew him beforehand and she also liked him. Mr. Easton was a smooth operator and eased into the situation easily. The marshal intervened timely to save them from embarrassment as well as to protect the young woman before matters got out of hand.